Hello, and welcome to this edition of People in Transition. I'm your host, Bob Gerst. I've been hiring and mentoring executives, frontline employees, and job seekers for nearly 40 years through a host of transitions, some difficult, but most very good. This experience has given me a bird's eye view on a variety of trends, economies, industry disruptors, and transitions, big and small. It also brought me into contact with the thought leaders and decision makers you need to meet. Imagine knowing exactly what to do next and how to know it's time to make your big job change. We all know transitions can be scary, but it doesn't have to be. And it's even fun when you have actionable strategies and proven tactics to achieve the future you want. We'll share with you the tools and skills that can take your dreams to your next great job. So if change is on your horizon, you won't want to miss this discussion. Also, please subscribe to this podcast so you won't miss any future episodes. Thea, Kelley, thank you so much for being with us on this episode of People in Transition. I was really looking forward to this discussion.
Yeah, me too. Thank you very much for inviting me on the show, Bob. It's an honor to talk to you and your audience.
Thea, one of my signature questions is, what was it that you thought as a child you wanted to be someday when you grew up?
Well, I wanted to be a famous singer. And I think I was thinking like a rock star, basically. Unusual. I know very few people have that dream, right?
What were the transition moments that you have gone through from that picture of yourself as a child as being a singer to where you're at today?
I actually majored in singing as my first bachelor's degree. Later, I went back and got a more sensible journalism degree, which is more relevant to what I do now. But as I was in that degree, I realized that it was just extremely competitive and very few people ever make a career at it. And in other words, I grew up. I realized that that was going to be a lot more struggle than I wanted to deal with.
Thea, let's dive right into a few things that you and I have talked about before. And many of these comes from your book, which for my listeners, I would really recommend. The title of it is Get That Job, The Quick and Complete Guide to Winning an Interview. You talk about Rev points. What are they and how will they help a candidate stand out?
First of all, I think it's really important to come into an interview proactively knowing what your main points are that you're trying to communicate and what it is that's going to stand out about you compared to the other candidates. And that's not quite exactly the same as what are your strengths, because your strengths may be things that are very common that all the other candidates have. So what you're looking for is to identify like a top 3 or a top 5 things about you that are likely to differentiate you from the other candidates. And I call them Rev points because that's an acronym that tells you what those points need to have in order to really be effective in the interview. So the R in Rev stands for relevant. I also call them your key selling points or Rev points, your differentiators. They need to be highly relevant. They need to be something that's really being sought after. For instance, some people come to me as interview coaching clients and say, well, I think my best Rev point is that I'm versatile and I can do a lot of different kinds of things. Well, that's a good thing and it is helpful on the job, but interestingly, it's not really what employers are usually most looking for. You don't really see them advertising, we want a jack of all trades who can do a lot of different things. Usually they're looking for more for people who are really great at a very small set of things. Your Rev points have got to be things that are super relevant and in demand. The E in Rev is exceptional. So again, it can't be something that the other candidates are likely to also have. It should be something that's a little bit unusual. And the V stands for verifiable, by which I don't mean that it can be verified in a background check. I just basically mean that it needs to be something that's a fact rather than your opinion, something that is tangible, that you can give some kind of evidence for it. So, for instance, saying I'm good with people could be a good Rev point, but only if you can somehow really convince them with either a story or social proof of some sort that this is really true and not just your opinion. So that's why I call them rev points. And probably the next thing you're wondering is, how do I identify what my rev points are? It's a process of asking yourself certain questions. And some of the questions I would ask if I were working with you out there in the audience would be, what qualifications or skills do you have that are hard to find? And by the way, as I ask these questions, if you're working on developing your rev points, you don't need to have a great answer to every one of these questions. And there's about 15 questions in the book. And if you have great answers to only 3 or 4 of them, you'll be able to identify some great rev points. Just for a couple other examples, another one is, what do I do better than most of my peers? What have my coworkers and managers really appreciated most about me? Am I the best at something, or the first, or the only one? That's more of a toughie, but if you are, that can be a really effective thing. What part of your job are you most passionate about, and are you especially good at that? So it's by asking questions like that that you can identify what are these things about you that stand out, that can be your rev points in the interview, that you can then proactively make a point of not bringing up saying like, these are my rev points, Mr. Employer, but more like making sure that you put in a lot of examples as you're talking that demonstrate these things.
Makes great sense. What I'm hearing you say is that you need to do some upfront work before you even start doing any interviewing. Is that what you coach your clients?
Oh, definitely. Being prepared is extremely important for interviews. If you're not prepared, you're likely to kind of ramble and wander in your interview, and you're not going to make a strong impression. You're also much more likely to be nervous. So the more prepared you are, the more confident you're going to be, and the more clear and compelling you're going to come across.
And do you have and use the same rev points for each of your interviews, or are they going to be different somehow?
That's a really good question. They're going to probably be similar from one interview to another. So you can start, even if you don't have a specific interview coming up, you can start by developing general rev points that relate to you and the types of jobs you're looking for. But then when you're applying to a specific job, I almost said when you've been granted an interview, but that might be too late because it might be the next day and you might not have time to prepare. So when you've applied to a given job, then you can ask yourself, how do I need to adapt my rev points for this? And so one thing you can do is develop more than that 3 or 5 rev points that I mentioned. Develop 8 or 9 if you can think of them. And then you can pick and choose per interview which ones are most appropriate.
And do you have any suggestions? Do you use someone else to help you develop these rev points, or certainly to kind of pressure test them to make certain that others think that these points are relevant, exceptional, and verifiable?
Yeah, good idea. So definitely asking your coworkers, your peers, to the extent that you're not going to be outing yourself as a job seeker if you're still on the job, but asking people you've worked with, what do you think stands out about me? Because sometimes others see that about us more than we see it. So that can be very valuable. And then as far as kind of testing them against other people, not specifically as rev points themselves, because I think most people won't really understand that concept. But what you could say is, I'm wondering what are the things that most stand out about me. I'm thinking they might be this, this, and this. Or better yet, work those rev points into an answer to the question, tell me about yourself. And then try that out on somebody in a mock interviewing situation. And after you've given your answer, ask them, how did that work for you? And after they give you some general feedback, then you might specifically say, also emphasize what differentiates me from other candidates. What did you get from that? What did you hear as being the differentiators? And see if it's coming across clearly. That'd be a good way to do it.
Yeah, you've talked with me before about interview storytelling. What is that, and why do you think that that's an important part of the interview?
Yeah, so people have heard about interview storytelling a lot of times. Everybody's kind of aware of it. And yet I find that there are some ins and outs of it that aren't really well grasped. But first of all, the reason it's super important, there's several reasons. One is, it's one thing to say my approach to managing a merger and keeping people's morale high is to do this, this, and this. But then if you don't go on to give a story about the merger that you went through and exactly what you did and really what the results were of your actions, For all they know, you might be just kind of giving them a textbook answer, saying what you think a person should do, and it's a lot less believable. It's easier to BS somebody in vague and general terms than to BS somebody with a detailed story. So it's more credible to tell a story. It's also more memorable because they can see it in their mind's eye. They begin to have a mental movie of you on the job doing these excellent things. And so they not only believe it more, because seeing is believing, even if it's in your mind's eye, but they also are much more likely to remember what you said. And lastly, of course, they're going to ask behavioral interview questions, and those require stories. So you have to have plenty of stories so you don't get stumped by a behavioral. But I do advise, use them even when they're not asking a behavioral question. Offer examples very generously throughout the interview. And, part of it is by offering examples, you're being a lot more specific. You're not being vague and general. And specifics really communicate much better in interviews.
And Thea, you talk about advanced techniques, which for me really sounds difficult. And I'm trying to juggle everything in the job search process. And now I've got to use something called advanced techniques. What are they? And are you sure that we're just not making this whole process more difficult than what it needs to be?
My advanced technique suggestions are not intricate or complex. They're just simply things you might not have thought of. One is, people listening out there are probably familiar with things like the STAR format, which is usually expressed as situation, task, actions, results. Great. One little advanced thing is some people think of that T as being, rather than tasks, which is kind of implied by the situation and the actions, that T might mean targets that you set for yourself proactively on your own initiative for what you wanted to achieve. So that can be a good reminder. Think of that as targets, okay? Like the situation was that our enterprise software system was out of date and just not working well for us. So the target that I set for myself was not only to identify a better system, but to make sure that that system had the buy-in and enthusiasm of a lot of people on the staff, or at least that various people on the staff had been consulted and asked about what they wanted in a system. See what I mean? You could do it that way and think of it as your target in a more proactive way. The acronym actually I use is not STAR, but SOAR, SOAR. And again, you're going to talk about the situation, S for situation, and you're going to talk about the actions you took and the results. But the O part is what's different. And this is optional, but the O stands for obstacles. What that means is not the initial presenting problem, like the fact that the enterprise software system wasn't very good, but it's the additional obstacles that came up along the way that made it more challenging for you to take the actions that you were taking to get to your results. And so a lot of times the obstacle along the way is something like somebody suddenly was out sick for a week, or you were short-staffed from the very beginning, perhaps, or there was a really tight deadline, or there was resistance from other people. And so as you prepare your stories, ask yourself, was there an obstacle here that by explaining how I cleverly overcame that obstacle, it's going to make my story that much better? And sometimes this can make your story longer. So realize you don't always have to include an obstacle, but sometimes it's really going to make your story a lot more effective.
So Thea, are there any other techniques that you'd like to talk about?
Yeah, just a few that I'd like to mention more quickly. One thing is what I call expandable answers. Now, we all know it's important for your interview answers to be concise. And most interview answers should be, some people say a minute long, and I think that's a great place to start. Some people say 2 minutes for a longer answer, rarely more than that. But what if there's a lot more you could say when you're asked a certain question and you think, oh, there's so much I could say here? How about using an expandable answer, meaning give your 1 minute answer and then end with something like, there's more I could say about the cool features of this product or the benefits of the project I undertook, whatever, but I know we have a limited time. Would you like to know more about that? And let them decide whether they want you to say more. So I call that expandable answers. Start short and then offer to say more. Another advanced technique is if you are answering a question like, tell me about yourself, and so it's already probably a fairly long answer, at least a minute, maybe 2, although that answer really should only be about a minute, I would say. You don't have time to include a full story in that answer, but you can give a little teaser. So you can say something like, maybe you're answering, tell me about yourself, and you're talking about your current job, and you say, I've been particularly successful in doing XYZ, and here's the teaser. I have a story about that I'd love to tell you at some point. And then you go on and finish your answer. So now, even if you never get a chance to actually tell the story, your answer already has extra credibility because you've made it clear that you can back up what you were saying with a story. And maybe they'll ask for it later. Last advanced technique, if you can't decide which story to tell, so they've asked you a question and you're thinking of two good stories, offer both and let them choose. Why do you have to pick? So let's say the interviewer says, tell me how you handled a difficult situation. You can say, I can think of two stories. One involves a team member who is having conflicts with others, and the other is about a client who wanted to change the scope of the project. Which of those stories sounds more interesting to you? And let them choose. So that's enough of those advanced techniques, and I hope those have been helpful to you.
Thea, you talk about the interview as a process of educating the interviewer. I find that really an interesting line. What does that mean to you, and how do you do that?
So this one can be really helpful for people who are uncomfortable, interviewees who are uncomfortable feeling like they're bragging, uncomfortable selling themselves. I say, instead of thinking about selling yourself, think of it as educating the interviewer on something they really need to understand, which is why they might want to hire you. Because they've made time in their schedule to find out whether they should hire you. So you're simply being helpful and educating them on why they should. Beyond that, you can think about certain principles of education. One is people learn from stories. And if you think about good teachers you've had, you might remember that they were telling stories. Another principle of education is that sometimes you need to repeat things a little bit. So that doesn't mean repeating yourself and saying things you've just said. What it means instead is kind of reviewing. So you might tell a full-length story and then you might say, so that's how I solved X problem by doing Y. And there, you're just kind of reviewing it a little for them. But above all, the main thing that's useful about this is just knowing that you're there to educate and inform, and you don't need to think of yourself as a huckster.
You say that a candidate should think about the pain points of the company that you're talking with. What does that mean?
They're hiring you to solve problems. And if you're not sure what those problems are, and very likely you aren't, it's really useful to find out because then you can address those things. One good way to do that is you haven't started the interview yet, but you've introduced yourself and there's some small talk going on. How are you doing today? Whatever. It's a good moment to say something like, before we get started, I wonder if I could ask you a quick question. They'll probably say yes. And then you say, so of course I've studied the job posting, but I'd really like to know, in your view of it, what do you think is the most crucial thing the person in this role has got to achieve? And that can identify pain points right there. It definitely will get you in touch with what that person thinks is important, and then you can focus on that throughout the rest of the interview. And this is especially important in the interview with the hiring manager. I think maybe with the initial HR screening, that might not really be the moment to ask a question like that. But with the hiring manager or somebody higher up from their level, like if there's a CEO interview, very important question to ask. And by asking it at the beginning of the interview rather than at the end, you can then make use of what you've learned.
Thea, you talk in your book about what more than words can say as you're talking with the hiring manager. What are you talking about here, and what should the candidate be thinking and doing in this area to present themselves most well?
So as you might guess, that's about nonverbals. So these are things like eye contact. Eye contact may be easy in person, but let's say you're doing a video interview. Eye contact is one of the most common mistakes that people make when doing a video interview, because you may know that in order to seem like you're making eye contact with the interviewer, you have to look at the camera. But at the same time, you're wanting to look at their face in order to get a read on what their responses are to what you're saying. And so you can do this unnatural dance of looking back and forth between their face and the camera, their face and the camera. That's better than nothing. But even better than that is if you can reduce the size of the Zoom window or the whatever, platform you're on, reduce it to a small square and then move that on your desktop till it's right next to the camera. And that way, as you're looking at their face, it will seem like you're looking into the camera. In other words, making eye contact. And I have taught this to many, many of my clients. And if they're able to do it right then during our coaching session, they always go, oh, that's great. That's so much easier. So remember that one. So beyond eye contact, smiling is important. And some people are very serious in interviews and never smile. And it is important to smile now and then. So when should you smile? The natural places to smile are when you're talking about something you're enthusiastic about or something that went well, when you're talking about the results. And by the way, when I talked about stories, I forgot one really important thing. Out of that situation, action, results acronym, the R for results, the most important part and the most neglected. You want to say a lot about what the results were. Try and quantify them if you can. Maybe mention what other people said about the outcome and the benefits of what you did. Maybe mention that what you did was then used more widely than you originally intended it. They adopted it in another department, or they're still using it to this day. So look for ways to talk a lot about results. And that's a great moment to smile. It's very natural to smile there. You don't want to smile throughout the whole interview. You look maybe a little silly. But if you're a person who tends to be very serious, make sure you do it now and then. Posture is also important, even in a video interview or even in a phone interview where they can't see you. And some people stand up to do a phone interview. That's great. It'll make you sound more energetic. But at any rate, you never want to be slumped. Or I sometimes see that people are sitting kind of crookedly. They're leaning toward one side or the other for the whole time I'm talking to them until I finally say, do you realize you're leaning to the left this whole time? It becomes uncomfortable to look at. So that's something to just notice if you're doing that. Another nonverbal, it's about the way you talk, but not the words you're using. One thing a lot of people do is uptalk. And that means that as they're saying things, they're always letting their intonation rise like I'm doing, as if everything was a question. And of course, the impact of that is it makes you sound kind of uncertain, not confident, not authoritative. So watch out if you're doing that. And instead of saying it was very successful, say it was very successful. Extremes of volume as you're talking, being very quiet or being very loud, talking very fast or very slow, any kind of extremes. You just want to try and train yourself out of that. So that's the kind of nonverbals you want to watch out for or be aware of, as well as, of course, how you listen, that you're not just listening, thinking about what you'll say next, but you're really listening to what they're saying.
Thea, the interviewing journey, that process itself is an emotional roller coaster. How do you coach your clients to help deal with that highs and lows that are just going to be a part of that journey?
Over the long run, from one interview to another, as you go through all that, the first thing I think is just to be aware that it's perfectly normal to be stressed out about the process and perfectly normal to experience these roller coaster emotions. And you need to be kind to yourself about it. So instead of saying, dang, I really should be more this way, I should be more that way, to also just say to yourself, hey, this is hard. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. Make sure that throughout the job search process, you're getting enough exercise, enough sleep, that you're eating well, that you're taking time to do some fun things, that you're not neglecting family and friends during the process. Just keep your life healthy. And the part about exercise, I want to especially emphasize because again and again, it's been shown, even in scientific research, that exercise is as good for keeping your spirits up as antidepressants, if not actually better, is what I've read, as well as just helping you with your confidence and your energy level.
Thea, in your book, you talk about the 5 dangerous myths of references. Can you help us understand what that's all about?
There are definitely some misunderstandings out there about references. The first one is that the employer is going to just contact the people on the references list you've given them. You can't count on that. They may very well contact somebody else. Maybe they personally know that person from some conference or some past job. Maybe they're even just going to make a point of contacting people that you didn't put on your list. So be aware of that. And if you think that there is somebody out there who might be saying bad things about you, if you find that you're getting to the final interview and they're checking your references and then you're not getting an offer, especially if that happens multiple times, you might want to look into it. Another myth is if that happens, there's nothing you can do about it if you're getting bad references. There is something you can do about it. It's not easy, though. One thing you can do is if you're not sure whether you're getting bad references or not, you can hire a reference checking service. They can role play. They call up your employers and they role play that they're checking references for a job. And then they'll get back to you and tell you how it went and what they heard. And if you find out that somebody is talking you down, and I don't mean just, in some acceptable way, like saying, well, I'd rather not talk about that employee. You can't tell somebody not to do that. But if somebody's really talking trash about you, contact them and talk it over with them. Now, that's a hard thing to do if you didn't get along well with that past boss or whoever it is. But prepare yourself, contact them, say something like, hey, I know things didn't always go real great between us. And I made some mistakes too, and I've learned from them. And it really was a good learning experience. And right now, I'm trying very hard to start over, to get a new role, to take those learnings, those hard learnings, and move forward. And I wonder if I could count on you to either emphasize the positive if people contact you, or maybe just not say anything at all, because I really need to get a new start. How do you feel about that? And that can really soften a person up and make a difference. They might initially be uncomfortable and just say something like, I don't know, I'll think about it. But then you may find that trash talk kind of ends after that. Another thing is, if it really persists, you could hire an attorney to simply write a cease and desist letter to that person. Not very expensive thing to do. It's obviously going to cost something because these are attorneys, but it's pretty simple. They just send a letter and they make it kind of intimidating, make it sound like it would be a lot safer for you legally if you stop talking this person down. So those are some things you can do. Another myth is that past employers can only tell people your title, your dates of employment, and your last salary. Often that is all they'll tell. That may be what their company policy is, to tell no more than that. But that doesn't mean that they won't do it. And they're not legally prevented from doing it, at least not in most states, not that I'm aware of. So they can say more, just so that you know that. And the fourth myth is that all you need to do is put your reference people on a list and give it to the employer. There's a lot more you need to do. Not a lot more, actually. You need to, of course, ask them. You may also need to coach them a little bit. You may need to give them suggestions about what projects or what skills of yours would be especially relevant. If nothing else, it's a good idea to always send them the job description of the job they might be about to be contacted about, as well as a copy of your resume in case they've forgotten, just so that they can be well informed and not be, talking up your people management skills when the job you're interviewing for right now, it doesn't involve people management. It involves something else. You also want to stay in touch with your reference people. You want to check with them every time you're about to give out their name and make sure that they're not going to be away, that they're going to be available during that time, that their phone number hasn't changed, and so on. Lastly on this, there's a myth that you should go ahead and present your references early just to show how eager you are to have them contact people. I don't recommend this because you really don't want people wasting your reference people's valuable time calling them when maybe the employer is really not that serious about you yet. So I think most other career coaches will advise, don't offer your references until they're asked for.
Thea, are there any books or other resources that you would recommend to someone who is in transition?
Well, of course, the main book I would recommend is Get That Job, The Quick and Complete Guide to a Winning Interview, my book. As the title says, it's quick. You can read it pretty fast. It's very complete. It goes into all the things we've talked about. And it was called Excellent by Forbes magazine. So enough about that. You can get it on Amazon, B. Dalton, wherever. And it's actually very affordable. There's an ebook as well. Another resource I would suggest is I have a blog called greatjobsooner.com. If you subscribe to the blog once a week, you get my latest article in your email on Tuesday morning. And it's always very informative. This is not sales pitches. You're going to be getting informative things about all aspects of job search, not just interviewing, but also resumes, networking, LinkedIn, all kinds of things like that. So, and also if you subscribe to greatjobsooner.com, you get some free gifts that you can download. Lastly, another resource is you can work with me one-on-one, and I do free consultations. So just go to greatjobsooner.com and look for the free consultation button. And let's talk about your situation and see if it's a good match for me to be working with you.
Thea, we have covered so much information, tips, techniques. If you want our listeners to remember just 3 things, what are those 3 things you want them to take away?
I would say be prepared again, and don't wait until you have an interview scheduled in 2 days. Be prepared in advance. And yet at the same time, my second tip would be natural, by which I don't mean be off the cuff and just wing it. But what I mean is don't memorize answers. When you prepare for certain questions, prepare by creating a little talking points outline, not even in complete sentences, and then practice speaking out loud from that. So that way you'll sound more natural. And be human. That's part of being natural. Realize the interviewer is not a god. They're a person like you with vulnerabilities and interests and a sense of humor, probably. My third thing I'd like to leave you with is be specific. So answer questions in a very specific way, quantify things, tell stories. Don't be vague. Be specific.
Thea Kelley, I knew when we first connected that you would be someone that would really care enough about our listeners to share your past experiences, your knowledge, your insights into the recruiting process, and you delivered on all of that. Thank you so much for your time and input. We really appreciate it and had a lot of fun.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much for having me on the show, Bob.
Thank you for listening. We're working in unprecedented times. The purpose of these episodes is to give you the support and critical tools to adjust with the changing marketplace. I'll continue to introduce you to guests who have successfully survived their own obstacle course and can share useful information. If today's message was helpful to you, please share it on your social media. Your review and rating helps get this to more people. Also, if you have questions or podcast ideas for future conversations, reach out to me on LinkedIn. Change is constant. The more prepared you are for it, the better and easier the change will occur. Thank you again. This is your host, Bob Gerst. See you at our next episode.